So today I wanted to go into Mathetes, if I'm saying it right. I'm going to read one passage at the end. If you don't know this text, this is I didn't even know it for a while after even studying church history for a while. Because I think it was discovered, like a lot of them, in the 1900s or early 19th century, maybe 1800s. A single manuscript. It's internally anonymous, but most scholars date this document to the early part of the 2nd century. I think he said like roughly maybe 130 AD, 120 AD, which yes, historically is very early for early Christian history. Like that's after the New Testament, but it's like right after the New Testament. The last books of the New Testament being written at the end of the 1st century. So this is like the next generation of the apostles, basically. And that's very clear when you read how this is a Gentile. We can obviously tell that a Greek Christian convert speaking to basically it's like one of the first apologetic, you could say, writings. He's writing to an obvious non-believing friend, trying to convince him of what he learned in Christianity. What's interesting is what he says here at the end. I do not speak, this is not the final chapter, but one of the final chapters. I do not speak of things strange to me, nor do I aim at anything inconsistent with the right reason. You have to also, you have to remember these translations are always usually old translations too, because nothing's really kept up to date with these ancient documents with so few copies. So yeah, I just like, this is the best trend. They all kind of sound like the KJV, basically, if not older sometimes. I do not speak of things strange to me, nor do I aim at anything inconsistent with the right reason. But having been a disciple of the apostles, I am become a teacher of the Gentiles. I minister the things delivered to me to those that are disciples worthy of the truth. For who that is rightly taught and begun by the loving word, would not seek to learn accurately the things which have been clearly shown by the word to his disciples, to whom the word being manifested has revealed them, speaking plainly to them, not understood indeed by the unbelieving, but conversing with the disciples, who being esteemed faithful by him, acquired a knowledge of the mysteries of the Father. For which reason he sent the word, that he might be manifested to the world. And he, being despised by the people of the Jews, was, when preached by the apostles, believed on by the Gentiles. And he goes on, this is something else I marked. Then the fear of the law is chanted, and the grace of the prophets is known, and the faith of the Gospels is established, and the tradition of the apostles is preserved. Here I like to signify this. He uses Gospels plural, whereas almost all writers, Christian writers, in this time and later, would always refer to it in a singular, usually, as the Gospel. Even the New Testament refers to it singularly, but he says plural. And he also clearly distinguishes this from the tradition of the apostles, the oral tradition of the apostles. Now, why do I bring all this? Now, there's some scholars, I don't think most do, but some scholars, and definitely a lot of non-Christian skeptics, who try to argue that this document is not actually claiming to be by a disciple of the, because what is this implying? It's implying he knew the apostles. He knew the apostles. And presumably, he's saying he was a disciple, he was taught them. I mean, in this time, especially if you understand how old tradition was passed on too, that would mean he was with them for years. This wasn't just like a one-time, oh yeah, I once heard them preach once, and now he's already saying it. He's claiming like an actual relationship aspect with the apostles when they lived. That's what he's actually claiming. And why is this important? Well, because this document, as you can imagine when you read through it, it's very Christian, obviously. But what do I mean by that? I mean, it's clearly like he directly quotes Paul and claims it's by Paul, and claims, most scholars don't actually doubt that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. But the point is, like, he quotes 1 Corinthians, talking about Paul. I think he quotes a couple other Paul letters. There's other passages in here where he, though, clearly alludes to the 4 Gospels. The fact he uses the word, that obviously is reminiscent of John's Gospel. And, John's Gospel is a very unique one, who used language like that, where it was pretty much only John that we know of who would use that kind of language. So when you start seeing it in later writers like this, it obviously gives strong indication that they were familiar with John, probably the written gospel directly, but at very minimum, the stories in John's gospel. Now, I think he's talking about the written John and probably the others too. When he says, that's why I highlighted the gospels, like he uses it plural. That would make no sense if he's just talking about the oral preaching of the apostles. Even more when he separates that from the tradition of the apostles. And the tradition of the apostles is a phrase that we use later in the 2nd century by people like Irenaeus and others to clearly talk about the oral teachings passed on in the church by the apostles. So that not only does his language here show evidence that he was familiar with our written New Testament gospels, but also shows strong evidence that he was, again, a true disciple of the apostles when he says that. I emphasize that because the other interpretation I've sometimes heard is like, well, he's just speaking generally, or he's just saying that he considers himself like a student of the apostles because he's read and heard the traditions and stuff like that. But that just makes no sense when you read the entire letter and then come to this passage. It makes no sense within all the context because, like I said, this is an apologetic document. And then when you read this, I do not speak of things strange to me, nor do I aim at anything inconsistent with right reason. But having been a disciple of the apostles, he is defending his authority, basically. He's defending his ability to actually know the truth. And you could still maybe argue an interpretation that, well, that could still maybe be just him really strongly, studying and whatnot, not actually having a direct encounter with the apostles. But again, that just strains credulity, I would say, from the clear interpretation elsewhere. And that's just from that. When you then take into account he even cites the tradition of the apostles in this same context, again, yet more evidence he's clearly claiming to be a disciple of the apostles, like a literal disciple of the apostles. Also, when you read the rest of this, seek to learn accurately the things which have been clearly shown by the word to his disciples, to whom the word being manifested has revealed them, speaking plainly to them, not understood indeed by the unbelieving, but conversing with the disciples, who being esteemed faithful by him, acquired knowledge of the mysteries of the Father. For which reason he sent his word, he sent the word, Jesus, that he might be manifested to the world, and he, being despised by the people of Jews, was then preached by the apostles, believed on by the Gentiles. He's showing the clear transmission. That's also what he's talking about here. The whole context is about the transmission of the message originally preached by Jesus. So again, the very theme of the context fits more appropriately the idea that he's claiming to be a direct disciple of the apostles. In my view, it's very clear. That's clearly the natural interpretation. I just bring all this up to to show, to throw the last nail in the coffin that the other interpretation is just absurd. I'm sorry, that's obviously not what he's saying. Why do so many people insist on saying this? Because you could say, well, maybe he was lying, but that's the problem. It's this is an anonymous work that we just found, it was lost too. And this is the only, he never says who he actually is. The title of the work was attributed to Mathetes. Mathetes, again, I don't know quite how you say that. But he never declares his name in the work. Again, because he's writing this as kind of an apologetic letter to someone he clearly knew and who clearly knew him. So he didn't feel the need to emphasize his authority constantly, which again gives more credence to the fact he's being honest, because forgers and liars, especially in the ancient history, would very often overemphasize their authority constantly. Use the first person constantly. If you read the Gospel of Peter, that's just everywhere in that gospel. So I know that's not the only reason, but that's one reason why a lot of scholars, including non-Christian scholars, don't take that gospel and a lot of other non-New Testament gospels seriously. Because you read the Gospel of Peter, not only is it clearly using the New Testament Gospels and then expanding on them to make stories, more fantastical. In Gospel of Peter, during the resurrection, Jesus comes out of the tomb in front of everybody instead of, not being seen by anyone until later on when the women see him at the tomb. Instead, Jesus comes and presents his like he towers to the sky, like it says his head. He has like angels with him, angelic beings whose like heads reach the heavens. It says in front of all the soldiers and Jews and everybody. You can just tell that it's just clearly that is a case of embellishment. But the ironic thing is they're embellishing the actual true story, which was still a miraculous story, because again, the resurrection is the earliest story we have. There is no embellishment to happen to lead to the resurrection, because there's no other account but that within the earliest histories. But also, again, going back to forgeries, when you read the Gospel of Peter, it's routinely, like almost every other sentences, the writer saying, I, Peter, saw this. I, Peter. Like he even emphasizes, like he mentions himself twice. Like, I, Peter. Did you know that I'm Peter? Well, I'm Peter. And then he's like, goes to the next one. It's like, I, Peter. In case you forgot, I'm still not Peter. Something like, and that goes for a lot of other gospels not in the Bible that we know about, and just a lot of forgeries, especially in that time in general. So you read this, the implication, like the very fact that an alternative interpretation is at least possible that we had to debate over here, is just even more evidence of its authenticity, of the writer's authenticity again, the writer's trustworthiness, at least on this claim, because it's like he doesn't really feel the need to overemphasize himself. He's writing to a friend. He probably didn't even know we would be reading this. There's a very strong likelihood we wouldn't have been reading this if one copy wasn't finally discovered, a century ago. So yeah, very, very important evidence, because again, when you take into account then and say, okay, he's not lying. The other interpretation that he's speaking on some general student level is just doesn't mesh with, the context. And going on that point, we have external evidence against that too. Because when you read other church fathers that were written, after this guy, but still wrote within like basically the immediate next generation, like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, the people like this guy wrote in the early 2nd century, right? You then read the mid and late 2nd century church fathers, and they are just unanimous in talking about their predecessors, which would have been this guy, being disciples of the apostles, being in a tradition that went down to the apostles. All of them, unanimous, Tertullian, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, every single one of them brings up the tradition of the same language he uses, the tradition of the apostles, and talks about how in the early 2nd century and when they were young, people like this, they mention Ignatius, Polycarp. We have their letters too. They mention them being their teachers and and how they were conversant and directly with apostles like John, Peter. They literally name them. Paul. These people actually knew either all or some of the actual apostles, who obviously knew Jesus directly. I mean, not directly in the case of Paul, but Paul, saw the risen Jesus. He was the same generation as the apostles. He was friends with Peter. He was, regularly conversant, obviously, with all the other apostles too. But even then, like Polycarp, for instance, every source we have says that he knew John directly. And every source we have about John says that he was like I think the only apostle that wasn't like martyred and actually lived to old age. So obviously that fits, the claim that Polycarp could have known John directly, because John actually did live long. So again, you read this and it's strong evidence that this writer was directly conversant with the apostles. And why is that so significant? Because this writer, whoever wrote this, we can call it Mathetes if I'm saying it, I'm sure I'm saying it incorrectly. Mathetes, I can't say it. And I can say Irenaeus and Ignatius, Tertullian. I can't say that name for the life of me. It obviously seems similar to Matthew. I'm wondering if it's another spelling of Matthew, and it just looks that way because of the translation. But probably not. It's probably a different name entirely. But it doesn't matter. We don't even know what his name was. But we can actually be, I would say, be relatively certain of what he says here, about actually being someone who knew the apostles. And yet, he believed in the Gospels and in the New Testament account of Jesus. You read this whole writing, he doesn't always quote or allude to passages directly within the New Testament, but he very clearly, you can tell, is I would say, New Testament Christian. Like, that is exactly how anyone would describe him. He very clearly claims Jesus is God, like arguably even more than you can find in some of the New Testament books. Obviously showing that became a very emphasized doctrine. But I mean, not because it wasn't emphasized before, but because it was such an obvious, but precisely because it was such a well-known and just very obviously, what I'm trying to say, intense doctrine, the idea that that God became man, that obviously if that was preached by the earliest disciples and by consequence Jesus himself, then obviously it would naturally become even more emphasized later on, as anyone would expect that to. But yeah, like, he preaches very clearly doctrines about Jesus there, just directly from the New Testament. And again, what does that tell you? It says that he clearly heard these things from the apostles. People like to denounce oral tradition entirely. Now, the ancient world, this was not the telephone game. The ancient world, especially in this time period where precisely so few people were literate, they had to rely on their memories and passing on stories to know anything. So yes, am I saying they were better than you at it? Absolutely. Were they better than 10-year-olds playing telephone game in the school? Astronomically. This was their life. Like, there was an actual process to this that people don't even realize. Like, they had actual repetition schools they would train they would literally had memory training. The Greek philosophers did. The Jews absolutely did. And obviously both Greeks and Jews within the early Christian tradition, came from strong, wanting to hone your memory and preserve your traditions. Now, again, that doesn't mean all the details are going to get passed on reliably, 2 generations or 3 generations. This guy would be I guess you could call it 1 generation removed, because the apostles are the generation. They're the first sources. He is a second hand because he learned other disciples. But obviously, especially because, again, as we emphasized, and as we know from other Christian documents in that time, that this was like a student-teacher relationship. Like, he obviously was conversing with them regularly, throughout his life, is what we're getting, what we get from that. So for him to then, preach basically the New Testament, and as I would argue, you can actually see clear evidence that he knew and accepted the New Testament documents too. Many of them, at least. I mean, we don't have clear evidence he accepted all of them, but I would say probably most of Paul's letters. I think even Acts of the Apostles, and definitely multiple of the New Testament Gospels, if not all 4 of them. Definitely John's Gospel. And if he knew John's Gospel, then almost certainly he knew the first 3, is usually how it goes. Because John was the most unique out of all of them. And then the first 3 are so similar with each other that if you know one, you usually know the others. I mean, in this time. So yeah, there's really no doubt, I would say. This is as close historically certain as it gets just from this anonymous text. People like to say, we can't know that, we can't be that certain about history. It's like, no, you can. Once you argue it through, you look at all the facts, you understand the facts, then yes, we can be, I would say, as certain about things in the ancient world as some things today. Obviously not everything. I'm not saying this is the most certain fact of all time, but I am saying we have enough, this gives us enough evidence to believe this guy, really was conversant with the apostles, which gives strong evidence for at least many themes and stories, throughout the New Testament. And I have to emphasize, just from this guy, because there's several other people like this. There is a lot of evidence, historical evidence in support for the New Testament. My whole point is, like, on a minimalist view, we can just look at this one obscure anonymous source and still come to the same conclusion that, yep, the four Gospels, probably based off the actual apostles, even if you don't believe they were written by them and those who knew them as I do, even if you don't believe the traditional authors, it's still very hard then to dismiss that they did not have eyewitness access. And by that token, that there's not at least good, like, you could still maybe argue, oh, oral traditions, eyewitnesses, whatever. That still doesn't mean everything's true. Okay, go ahead and argue that. But it still means that probably the overarching general things for sure are preserved when you get that early to that account. Because what is the alternative? Are you going to say this guy just misremembered or lied about literally, like, you would have to argue that he either misremembered or lied about the majority of what, not details here and there, but the majority, in order to say that most of the New Testament is still fraudulent. Like that, you would have to argue that. And both those theories, of course, are absurd, because we just established how close he is and how he was in a relationship with the apostles. So to misremember that much, and then no one catch that, of course, throughout this expanded tradition with multiple lines of it throughout the church. That, of course, this just one-off somehow was the sole thing for the entire church. I'm sorry, that's absurd. And then by the same token, claiming deception, lies, whatever, that would imply a conspiracy already, because we already see the church is established. He's conversing with the apostles. So you're already arguing a conspiracy theory to argue any kind of lies and deception as at least the main. Again, you can argue maybe he was deceitful in little details here and there, like every human being might occasionally be tempted to do. I'm not saying that still means everything he says is trustworthy. But again, we're speaking on a general level. That's what we're speaking on. A general authority, a general level on how he clearly knew much of the New Testament, at least general idea themes like Jesus claiming to be God, preaching he was God. Not necessarily that, and Jesus said this exact same thing in the Gospels, like this exact same sentence. And maybe he snuck in something because he also believes this or whatever. We can have those arguments. Those are totally separate. We're talking about the overarching messages and themes within the New Testament, though, and the support that this author provides them. And lies and deception, that just doesn't mesh. Because on top of all of this, we know this guy in this time period especially he had nothing to gain but everything to lose by being a Christian in this period. Both by the early 2nd century, the official Roman government was actually having official persecutions of Christians. We know this from Emperor Trajan's writings to Pliny the younger elder, I believe, in the early 2nd century, so the same time period that he wrote this too. There were official persecutions going on. And then, of course, many Jews and many polytheist pagans in this time absolutely despised Christians, which we can see just in some of their writings, even like Celsus in the 2nd century, so in Jewish traditions and their animosity still towards Christians. Tacitus, again, writing in the same period, the early 2nd century, referring to Christians as a worthless, superstitious cult, and then pointing out that they were literally used as scapegoats by the public for the burning of Rome, to round them all up and execute them. Like this, again, lies makes no sense either. Anyway, I'm going too long now. Let me end it here. But yeah, this passage alone brings us lots of evidence, clearly.